Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Very warm welcome to tonight's online lecture from Sir John Soane's Museum in London. My name is Fiona Smith. I'm the Public Programmes Manager at the museum. Tonight's talk complements our current exhibition, Hidden Masterpieces, which runs until the 5th of June. The exhibition is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see some of the finest works amongst the drawings collected by Sir John Soane. These are usually kept in locked drawers and among carefully stored volumes at the museum. Described by the Financial Times as a beautifully choreographed exhibition, and in the Telegraph as the show to make you fall in love with architectural drawings, I do urge you, if you're in the vicinity, to visit the museum to see these astonishing works in person. And for those of you unable to do so, tonight's talk will certainly give you a flavour. There's also an online version of the exhibition on our website. So I'm very delighted to welcome the exhibition's curator, Dr. Francis Sands, Fran, who'll be considering the different types of architectural drawings found at Sir John Soane's museum and the many fascinating histories of the items within the collection. She'll explore highlights of the collection above and beyond those that we've been able to include in the exhibition, and will delve into the extraordinary conflation of events which led to Soane creating one of the finest collections of architectural drawings in the world. I should also mention the wonderful publication that accompanies the exhibition, and this, which Fran is holding up. As you can see, it's a mammoth publication and very beautiful. And this publication includes many more examples than we have space to display. And the publication is available to purchase via the museum's online shop. Dr. Francis Sands is Curator of Drawings and Books at Sir John Soane's Museum, London. Fran's research interests lie in early modern British architectural drawings. She's worked at the museum since 2010, first as catalogue editor, tasked with the monumental task of cataloguing the office drawings of the collection of Robert and James Adam. This vast project is still ongoing. In 2016, she was appointed the Curator of Drawings and Books, taking responsibility for the museum's wider collection of some 30,000 drawings and 7,000 books. She's curated various exhibitions and publishes and lectures widely. Since 2010, Fran has also served as a trustee of the York Georgian Society, the Mausolea and Monuments Trust, the Society of Architectural Historians of Great Britain, and she sat on the advisory committee for the Grinling-Gibbons Society's Tercentenary exhibition. Fran's going to be talking for around about 45 minutes and is very happy to take questions at the end. So if you'd like to ask a question this evening, if you could please type it into the Q&A using the bottom, at the bottom of your screen, the function at the bottom there. And we'll get through as many as we can at the end, and apologies in advance if we don't manage them all. So thank you very much, and over to you, Fran.
Thank you, Fiona. Please allow me to apologise to you all for the fact that this lecture has been delayed by a fortnight. That is entirely my fault. At the opening of the exhibition, I managed to catch COVID from somebody, so I've been unwell. I'm still a bit husky, but I'm thankfully feeling okay. So thank you for bearing with me, and I'm sorry about that. Right, I'm just going to share my screen so you can see my images. Here we are. I hope that's working for everybody. Right, so as you've heard this evening, I'm going to talk to you about the subject of architectural drawings, and in particular, the collection at Sir John Soane's Museum, the highlights of which are the subject of our current exhibition, Hidden Masterpieces. And you can just see a couple of shots of our lovely galleries. Unfortunately, you can't see the whole show because these shots only show one side of each room. But do, as Fiona said, come and visit if you can. The show runs until the 5th of June. So the project for this exhibition came about because of the book that Fiona has mentioned. It was published in the summer of 2021, and it's entitled Architectural Drawings, Hidden Masterpieces from Sir John Soane's Museum. And it is quite an oddity for an exhibition to come out of a book rather than vice versa. So I'm very quickly going to tell you about how it all came about before moving on to our main subject for the evening. In May 2018, I was done the honour of being invited to Oxford to deliver a lecture for that university's public architectural history series. And I spoke about Sohn as a collector of architectural drawings. And little did I know it at the time, but the commissioning editor of the publishing house, Batsford, was sitting in the audience. Batsford is, I suppose one would say, an historic publishing house. It was founded in 1843, and they're now an imprint of Pavilion Books, but they do focus principally on arts and heritage. Anyway, I was none the wiser about this rather important person sitting in the audience. I'm sure there were many important people in the audience, but this one in particular. And shortly after the lecture, I was passed a message from the team at Batsford asking if I would be open to discussing a potential book project with them. And naturally, I was curious. So we met and we discussed the idea of a book in which we would use Sohn and the highlights of Sohn's drawings collection as a means of exploring the subject of architectural drawings more widely, and the issue of collecting architectural drawings. There would be a lengthy introductory essay, followed by 80 large-scale reproductions of some of the fabulous drawings, with a short bit of text explaining why each one is interesting or important, or actually usually both. The publication is pleasingly large format, as you've seen. Crikey, it's jolly heavy. It's not a book to be read in bed, I'm afraid. But that does mean that it can accommodate really gorgeous, large reproductions of the drawings that have been chosen. And here are a handful of the spreads from the book to give you the idea. So I wrote the book in 2019, and it was due for publication in the summer of 2020, but it was delayed until the summer of 2021, being yet another casualty of the pandemic. In the meantime, we at the Sohn Museum had hatched a plan inspired by the book to share this fabulous material, or some of it anyway, by compiling an exhibition of the highlights of Sohn's drawings collection, which could then travel to any institution who were interested. It would be a nice and an easy way to put together a really beautiful show. The book was already written after all. So at the end of 2019, I actually returned from a maternity leave, having written the book during my maternity leave. And we had at that point 2 prestigious institutions across the pond in America lined up to take the exhibition in the summer of 2020 and then the spring of 2021. But of course, just weeks after I returned back to work in the spring of 2020, everything changed, and those exciting plans were abandoned for obvious reasons. And yet, all was not lost. The book has been a success, and we've always planned to stage a version of the exhibition at the Sohn Museum ourselves, albeit perhaps a little later after it had been elsewhere. So perhaps a silver lining of of all of this is that the Sohn Museum has more quickly than originally envisaged been able to open a gorgeous exhibition within our own gallery, giving some of the real highlights of our drawings collection. So with that preamble out of the way, I'd like to share with you some of the background information as well as some of the content of both the show and the drawings collection. So first, how do we define an architectural drawing as opposed to any other type of 2-dimensional artwork? The word drawing is applied to an enormous variety of different media and art forms, spanning an array of techniques. For example, a charcoal sketch portrait versus a watercolor landscape, for example. Moreover, how has the concept of a drawing evolved over time? In the 14th to 16th century in Italy during the Renaissance, the word disegno described drawing or designing in monochromatic 2 dimensions, as here in these 2 examples. This didn't encompass the use of colour, but crucially it demanded both a skill in draftsmanship as well as the intellectual capacity for invention and creative design. This raised the artist, the draftsman, the creator, above the realm of other mortal human beings, aligning him or her with God the creator, and thus the 2-dimensional arts were placed hierarchically above other crafts. By the time we reach the early modern era, that higher notion of creation, of invention associated with disegno was to some degree lost. Drawing was no longer necessarily linked with the creative design process, as it became commonplace to copy for pleasure or indeed for professional purposes. Think of the work of a paid draftsman in an architect's office, for example. As such, drawing as an art form came to be associated with any artistic output in which drawing instruments such as pencils, pens, and brushes were used to make marks on paper or other two-dimensional media like vellum. It's the significance of the drawn line onto which wash or other media can be applied that distinguishes a drawing from a painting. A watercolor drawing will overlay a guide of lines of drawing, usually in pencil. But when an artist applies watercolor directly to the paper in a more fluid manner, without the guide of any lines, this is generally considered to be a painting. And naturally, there are a great many exceptions to this. For example, painters using oils nearly always rough out their compositions in lines before applying the paint, or with drawings themselves, the use of dots, either drawn or pricked with a pin from one sheet to another, can also serve a similar purpose to the drawn line. So it is a little bit difficult to define sometimes the difference between a drawing and a painting, especially when you're dealing with watercolor. But I think the thing to look out for is those sort of guiding marks. By far the largest portion of the drawings collection at the Soane Museum consists of architectural drawings as opposed to any other genre, such as portraits or landscapes. And this is obviously fairly unsurprising, considering Soane's professional and personal architectural interests. I'm sure you're all aware, but in case you're not, Soane was a prolific and successful architect, as well as a collector and teacher, and the creator and founder of his eponymous house museum, Sir John Soane's Museum. Among his varied collection, there are some 30,000 drawings, far outnumbering any other media of art in the collection. But perhaps, surprisingly, the collection of drawings really came later in his life than many of the other media of art within the Soane Museum collection. And I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. But it's important to note that Soane's wider drawings collecting activity, of course, does not include the drawings produced by his own hand and his own architectural practice, which had no need to be collected as they originated in Soane's office at his house. And they are numerous. We have around 8,000 examples in the collection, 2 of which you can see here. And they were produced throughout Soane's career. His acquisition of drawings by others, though, was piecemeal and skillfully opportunistic, like much of his collecting activity. The result is a drawings collection that's well balanced across a variety of periods, geographies, and indeed subject matters. The only exception to this balance is the vast office drawings collection of the Scottish neoclassicists Robert and James Adam, which numbers 9,000 sheets and outnumbers even Soane's own office drawings collection. However, I do believe that it was with due thought that Soane bought the Adam drawings collection and brought them into his museum, having first declined their purchase and then negotiating such a good price that he couldn't really turn them down. The graphic output of such an influential past architect must have just been irresistible. And again, I'll say more about all of that later. So together, the amassed collection of drawings at the Soane Museum comprises one of the most significant in Britain. The vast majority have remained in excellent condition, as for almost 2 centuries they've lain largely undisturbed. It's only in very recent years, since 1995, with the creation of the Soane Museum's first exhibition gallery, that temporary exhibitions have allowed the display of drawings to the public, albeit under very carefully controlled conditions and in extremely limited numbers. The drawings from Soane's own architectural practice are almost as varied as the wider museum collection itself. Not only was he a prolific architect, as I mentioned, he produced seemingly endless designs for his many commissions, but he was also a teacher and a prominent member of the Royal Academy, where he exhibited with impressive regularity, usually with drawings of his architectural designs in the hand of Joseph Michael Gandy, like this one. Gandhi was an extraordinarily skilled draftsman and artist. And in Gandhi, it seems Soane had found the perfect counterpart. A man, unlike Soane, who had the time to produce such lavish drawings, being particularly useful as Soane grew older and his eyesight began to fail. And in Soane, Gandhi had found a wealthy patron who could be relied upon to provide very regular and generous employment. So it was a very happy relationship, and many of the drawings produced by Gandhi for exhibition at the Royal Academy later found a home among the framed works of art on the walls at the Soane Museum. Others were commissioned by Soane specifically for that purpose, to be framed and hung on the walls of the museum. Sometimes they illustrate the interiors of the museum itself, which is rather nice. And here's a really lovely example that can be found in the picture room at the Soane Museum. Towards the end of Soane's life, as the Soane Museum came to be viewed by his contemporaries as a national institution, it's unsurprising that he should exhibit the finest draftsmanship of the age, and moreover that Gandhi's work should celebrate Soane's own architectural output. Perhaps slightly less glamorous than Gandhi's work, the everyday work of Soane's architectural office usually focused on drawings made in preparation for Soane's various architectural commissions, be they country houses, townhouses, churches, monuments, or public buildings. For each project, be it large or small, it would have been necessary for an early modern architectural office to produce reams of drawings of different configurations. The vast majority of these architectural drawings take the form of an architectural plan, elevation, section, or perspective. And again, for those who are unfamiliar with the terminology here, a plan, as here, is a drawing illustrating the footprint and also often the internal arrangement of a building on a horizontal plane, that is, as if seen from above. An elevation shows a building directly head-on, orthogonally, as it's known, on a vertical plane, so without the benefit of any perspective at all, straight on. A section cuts through a building at a right angle on a vertical plane, either axially or longitudinally. And this is a lovely mode of representation because you can often see the interiors. And then finally, a perspective view is a mode of pictorial representation, depicting the subject within a naturalistic composition, complete with one or more vanishing points. And incidentally, this gorgeous drawing showing the Admiralty screen on Whitehall by a master draftsman from the office of Robert Adam is included in the current exhibition. It's actually one of my favourites. So each of these methods of drawing appeared in England at different times, starting with the plan and elevation, but all were commonplace by the 17th century. However, by Soane's lifetime, it was also typical to utilise a handful of other drawing formats. For example, the bird's eye view, for example, this one, this gorgeous drawing. It's one of the earliest bird's eye view drawings produced in Britain. And I'm hoping to include this in a future exhibition at the Soane Museum, so keep your eyes peeled. Also, there is the flyer or flap, which can overlay an alternative concept on top of an original drawing. The garden designer Humphrey Repton used these very heavily in his famous red books to show a potential patron before and after views of his different designs. And I hope that you can see that here in this gorgeous plate from one of Repton's red books within the Soane Museum collection. As you can see on the left, the flap is down, and on the right, the flap is up, showing an alternative arrangement of planting. There's also the laid out wall elevations, sometimes known as an exploded plan for fairly obvious reasons. And this offers the walls and often also either the floor or the ceiling of a single interior, a single room, displayed like an unfolded cardboard cutout. And so with all these different forms of drawings, an early modern British architectural office was accustomed to producing material of considerable variety. Naturally, some of these drawing formats are easier for the lay person to read or interpret than others. And as such, excuse me, certain drawing types predominated in early modern British architectural practices, depending on whether a drawing was intended for use within the office by the architect and his draftsman, or perhaps by an executant artisan or builder, or whether they were actually intended for perusal by a client who might not necessarily be schooled in how to understand different types of architectural drawings. It's for this reason that perspectives and bird's eye views, complete with a suitable topographical context, were popular for engraving and publication, as they are as undemanding and straightforward to the layperson as a beautiful picture postcard. However, the Soane office and other Georgian contemporaries would not simply produce one copy of each drawing. Indeed, by the 18th century, the typical architectural process of design and drawing production was multi-layered. The first task was to send a trusted draftsman or surveyor to the building site in order to make survey drawings of any pre-existing architecture, or perhaps simply the topography of the building site, in order to provide the architect back in his office with the relevant information needed in order to undertake a design. Survey drawings take different forms, but as their principal function is to relay an accurate representation, they're often drawn quite simply, but to scale, or very thoroughly dimensioned, and without any unnecessary ornamental flourishes which might distract or confuse. No colour, for example, usually. So here we have a survey drawing of a pre-existing house on the left, drawn by a local surveyor, and on the right, having been informed by that survey drawing, we have the Soane office design for improving that same house. Next, the actual process of design would begin. The first phase of the design process was almost exclusively the territory of the architect rather than his draftsman. Soane himself would produce the earliest preliminary designs as a means of developing his initial ideas, often very simply sketched in pencil or pen to a rough scale and without the hindrance of wash, as on the left. Such sketches would then be passed along to the draftsman in order to work up the design, draw it to scale, and thereby translate the freehand preliminary sketch into a more cohesive design, as on the right. In the Soane office, such drawings were often overdrawn and annotated by Soane himself as the design evolved, and one can only think of the poor apprentices and draftsmen who would have been spending ages creating these gorgeous scaled drawings only for Soane to come along and scribble all over them. It must have been slightly disheartening. Once Soane was satisfied with the various elements of any given design, it was then necessary to produce a finished or fair drawing, or often a whole series of them, providing a fully worked up, neat version of the design, drawn to scale, usually washed in grey or colour, and often produced by more than one draftsman, depending on the differing skills of each person. If this version of the design was considered by Soane to be of sufficient quality, it would then be presented to the client, be they an individual or a committee, as a means of explaining and promoting the design idea. The hope was that he, she, or they would invest in the design and that it would come to fruition. However, there are numerous finished drawings within the Soane office collection which, for one reason or another, were not deemed by Soane to be appropriate for the client, or not good enough anyway, and as such it was common for multiple copies and versions of finished drawings to be produced at huge cost, both in materials and time. Where there's evidence that a drawing had been found worthy of one of Soane's clients, then it's known as a presentation drawing because it was quite simply presented to the client. This example for one of the interiors at the Bank of England is obviously a rather lavish, rather gorgeous example of a finished drawing, and I can't pretend they're all quite this beautiful. Note too that presentation drawings were sometimes submitted to architectural competitions in a bid to win a commission, as with this example from the office of Robert Adam for a funerary monument in Westminster Abbey. Sadly, Adam did not win this competition, so this design was never actually built. Should a client be pleased with the drawings and instruct their architect to contract craftsmen in order to execute a design, then it was necessary for an entirely new series of drawings to be produced. Presentation drawings made for the client were considered to be works of art, conveying a concept in the most alluring means possible, but not necessarily providing enough detailed information for the building process. As such, it was then necessary for the architectural office to provide a series of so-called working drawings, which would each deal with one small element of the design. This is an example from the office of William Chambers for part of Somerset House. Drawn to scale and annotated with all the relevant information that the builder or craftsman might need, working drawings provided comprehensive design instructions to the executant artisan in order that the designs might be faithfully reproduced in 3 dimensions. In the words of Edwin Lutyens, a working drawing is merely a letter to a builder telling him precisely what is required of him, and not a picture with which to charm an idiotic client. After all, it would have been no use if the drawings alone were captivatingly elegant, only for the finished building to fall short of the client's expectations. That's not the way to get repeat customers, I would think. During the 18th century, the administration of most architectural offices had become increasingly meticulous, and it was typical to maintain a series of office record drawings, which would duplicate the designs that had been offered to various clients. Here's an example from the Adam office. This would be done for 2 fairly obvious reasons. Firstly, to document those designs which had actually been presented to the client, and secondly, to prevent any embarrassing repetition in the work provided to different clients. It'd be rather awful if you suddenly found that you had the same drawing on ceiling as your next door neighbour, for example. Record drawings were usually made with extreme care. They were drawn to scale, albeit often reduced in size from a presentation drawing, as paper was very expensive. And they were often only partially washed, as here, or sometimes just annotated with notations of colour, in order to provide all the necessary information while maintaining a maximum of economy. As record drawings represent a design which was perceived to be complete, they're very rarely overdrawn with alterations, and they were often made and kept in groups or mounted together into volumes. In the case of Soane's own record drawings, there are 18 surviving volumes in the Soane Museum collection. In the late 1790s, these record volumes were divided by Soane into town and country projects, doubtless as he was anxious to publish his work and needed to assemble his designs in an appropriate arrangement. The publication of architectural designs had been commonplace since the early 18th century, and particularly since Colin Campbell's vastly popular publication of Vitruvius Britannicus in 1715 to 25. Like many of his predecessors, Soane was keen on architectural treatises as a means of disseminating and advertising his work. He produced 7 publications during the course of his career. Graphic material for illustrating publications was produced in the form of engravings, with the author providing his engraver with a series of drawings from which to work. Clearly, the drawings made for publication, similar to those produced for exhibition, illustrated only those designs with which the author was most pleased, whether they'd been executed or not. They tended to be produced as elevations, simple plans, or those perspective views, either head-on or from bird's eye view. Here are some very good examples of these rather simple presentation formats that were often produced for publication. More rare are more complex plans and sections which contain more detailed structural complexities and are therefore rather more difficult to understand. In order to keep pace with the vast number of drawings needed to fulfill Soane's various commissions and indeed publications, his office grew quite considerably as time progressed. From early in his career, September 1784, Soane began to accept articled pupils whom he instructed in the art, profession and business of architecture. He took his pedagogical, his teaching responsibilities extremely seriously, stressing the importance of superior draftsmanship techniques, accurate and honest estimates of costs, and a profound understanding of construction and building materials. The pupils' day generally comprised running errands and undertaking drawing work. Architectural training drawings are yet another interesting type of drawings. But from 1810 onwards, the pupils would also be fortunate enough to visit Soane's building sites, having been tasked with the production of so-called progress drawings, as here you have two examples. A rough sketch would be made on the building site, and then on returning to the office, the apprentice would redraw their sketch more formally and wash it in colour. Seemingly rare at the time, progress drawings were a means of recording the evolving construction process on the building site. Inspiration for this type of drawing may have reached Soane from the work of Giovanni Battista Piranesi, or other such unusual depictions of construction in progress. For example, this circa 1512 onwards Flemish Book of Hours from Soane's collection. This is actually the earliest item included in the exhibition, a gorgeous little gem of an object, and it contains illuminations of various liturgical subject matters, and this one quite clearly shows the construction of the Tower of Babel. So it is a very, very early depiction of architecture and construction. And considering Soane's interest in that subject, I'm quite sure he would have been fascinated by this. So we might assume that the rationale for the production of progress drawings by Soane's apprentices was for Soane himself to be updated on progress, although this would more typically fall within the remit of a project's clerk of works. Soane's pupils only really made progress drawings on building sites within Greater London, within walking distance of Soane's office in Lincoln's Inn Fields. They didn't go further afield for this purpose, for example, to Soane's many country house projects. Clearly, the production of progress drawings was not a comprehensive undertaking across Soane's works. It's likely that Soane's intentions were didactic and driven by a desire for his pupils to scrutinise building sites, construction processes, and the application of various building materials. It was part of their training, indeed a learning process that Soane advocated when he started giving lectures at the Royal Academy. In 1806, at the age of 53 and acclaimed for his architectural achievements, Soane was elected Professor of Architecture at the Royal Academy. This was an ideal calling for an architect who treated the education of his own office apprentices with such care. He compiled a series of 12 lectures for the Royal Academy to be delivered at a rate of 6 per year. It was a 2-year course. And it detailed, the collective lectures detailed the history of architecture and offered Soane's opinions on the best and worst examples of the craft. As the Napoleonic Wars raged across the English Channel, it would have been unwise, if not impossible, for Soane's Royal Academy students to attempt continental travel in order to peruse the architectural delights of Italy and beyond, as Soane himself had done during his grand tour in the 1770s. So in order to address this failing in their education, Soane instructed his own office to create a little over 1,000 large-scale lecture drawings illustrating significant buildings from across the reaches of history and geography. These would not only illustrate Soane's words, but also function as case studies of the key principles of the architectural profession. A suitable selection of these drawings would be displayed in the Great Exhibition Room at Somerset House during each of Soane's Royal Academy lectures, rather like a PowerPoint today. And from 1812 onwards, Soane invited his students to peruse both the lecture drawings and his wider collection at his home in Lincoln's Inn Fields on the days before and after each of his lectures. 2 of these examples of lecture drawings, incidentally, are included in the exhibition. And if you visit, you might be surprised by the very, very large scale at which they were produced. Soane had been inspired to create his Royal Academy lecture drawings by the example of Thomas Sandby, the Professor of Architecture at the Royal Academy when Soane himself was a student there. But whereas Sandby produced some 128 lecture drawings, Soane's efforts were on an entirely different scale, bigger, better, and far more numerous. Without any remuneration from the Royal Academy, this extraordinary collection was produced on a purely philanthropic basis and is thought to comprise the earliest attempt at a graphic history of world architecture. As we know, Soane was an ardent advocate of architectural education, the lecture drawing collection being yet more evidence of that conviction. But the lecture drawings also offer a glimpse of Soane's personality and his values. Having been produced principally by his office apprentices through observation of drawings and engravings in Soane's collection, Soane was providing employment to his office, particularly the younger, aspiring members of that group, during the otherwise relatively lean years of the Napoleonic Wars. Instead of reducing the number of people in his employ, Soane engineered work for them to do, which he funded himself, and that resulted in one of the most masterful pedagogical efforts of his generation. Prior to his professorship at the Royal Academy, Soane had been relatively cautious in collecting drawings, and it was really his teaching activities that spurred him to collect more enthusiastically. So not only was he having his office produce the lecture drawings, but he was going out and buying more drawings too. And presumably this was just to provide additional educational material. Having said that, Soane probably first encountered a collection of drawings years earlier during his apprenticeship with the skilled and progressive architect George Dance the Younger. So clearly, having admired someone else's drawings collection, the concept stuck in his mind. By the time of his death in January 1837, Soane's drawings collection was composed of around 30,000 sheets, as I mentioned, and it resulted in the first comprehensive architectural drawings collection in Britain, preserving the finest examples of drawings from the Renaissance through to the Georgian period. It's with complete confidence the Soane Museum can claim one of the two foremost collections of architectural drawings in Britain. That fact still stands. The other is the drawings collection at the Royal Institute of British Architects, which incidentally was directly inspired by drawings collection at the Soane Museum. It's quite remarkable to think that this was the compilation of a single tireless man. Soane's first cautious foray into collecting drawings in Britain took place on the 10th of January 1795, when he acquired 286 drawings by the architect James Playfair at Christie's. This was followed 2 years later by the purchase of 20 capricci by the French artist Charles-Louis Clerisseau. But later, following the watershed of Soane's election as Professor of Architecture at the Royal Academy, as I've said, the acquisition of drawings gained increased momentum. The first purchase which marked this shift was a volume of drawings by the Elizabethan and Jacobean architect John Thorpe, which is actually also included in the exhibition. Much admired in the 18th century, particularly by Horace Walpole, the Thorpe volume of drawings is widely thought to be the most important collection of drawings to survive from the Elizabethan or Jacobean era, rivaled only by the famous Smithson collection at the RIBA. The early provenance of the Thorpe volume is basically unknown, but the former Soane Museum curator, Sir John Summerson, suggested that it passed during Thorpe's lifetime to a gentleman called Fulk Greville, who was later Baron Brooke of Warwick Castle. If this were the case, the volume might have lain undisturbed at Warwick Castle until the middle of the 18th century and the time of the first Earl of Warwick, a descendant of Baron Brooke, who played host to Horace Walpole, who sort of discovered the volume of drawings and started telling people about it and his excitement about it. So later, following an inquiry from the antiquarian John Britton in 1809, the second Earl of Warwick was unfortunately unable to find the Thorpe volume at Warwick Castle, a little bit embarrassing, but this was explained the following year when it appeared at Christie's in the sale of possessions belonging to the late Charles Francis Greville, the Earl's younger brother. You'd think he'd been rather naughty and pinched the volume. But anyway, Soane purchased the volume at the sale at Christie's for 27.5 guineas, but he immediately wrote to the second Earl of Warwick offering to return the Thorpe volume to Warwick Castle, but he received a very courteous response requesting that Soane should keep it. Soane's next significant purchase of drawings took place only a year later at a sale of the possessions of the 18th century architect Sir William Chambers. There are now over 800, almost 900 drawings by Chambers within the collection at the Soane Museum. But it's quite clear that not all of these came to Soane from the 1811 Chambers sale, where he spent only £14.11. His purchases did include two exceptional examples seen here. Chambers' design for a mausoleum for Frederick, Prince of Wales, made in 1751, which is included in the exhibition and is generally referred to as Chambers' finest drawing. And then there's this drawing of Nicola Salvi's Trevi Fountain in Rome, which had been a collaborative effort in 1753 between Chambers and the French artist Laurent Pecheux. Excuse me. There are also around 600 Chambers drawings for Somerset House, now in the collection at the Soane Museum. And these were bought in the 1811 Chambers sale for £52.10, but not by Soane. Rather, the Somerset House drawings were sold to an unknown person named Townley, although this can't have been the famous antiquarian and collector Charles Townley, as he had died 6 years earlier in 1805, so we don't actually know who the Townley was. And there's no evidence of how the Somerset House drawings collection came into the Soane Museum collection before Soane's death 26 years later, although we do know that Soane was very interested in Chambers, and he continued to acquire Chambers drawings in a rather more piecemeal fashion between around 1816 and 1826. The next significant acquisition of drawings in Soane's collecting career took place in 1818 and included some of the most important items now at the Soane Museum. These all came via the collection belonging to Robert Adam. Now remembered as one of the innovators of neoclassicism, Adam was the most prolific architect of the 18th century, but his finances were extremely strained in the last 20 years of his life because of the failure of a major speculative town planning development in London known as the Adelphi. At Adam's death in 1792, the neoclassical Adam style had still been very popular, particularly in Scotland. But within 10 years, fashion had changed to such an extent that there was little interest in anything that Adam had produced. When Robert's business partner, his younger brother James, died 2 years later in 1794, their property and possessions were inherited by their youngest brother, William, as well as two spinster sisters, Elizabeth and Margaret, who had acted as Robert and James's housekeepers in London. Despite the arrival of their financially comfortable niece, Susanna Clark, in 1810, who came to care for her the three elderly siblings, the family's financial situation was very precarious. William had been declared bankrupt in 1801 because of the remaining debts from the Adelphi. And in order to keep themselves afloat, William arranged for the sale at Christie's of Robert and James's library and art collection in 1818 and their personal effects in 1821. Soane purchased very heavily at the 1818 Adam sale, including numerous books and drawings, and perhaps the most significant among these were items from the famous Cassiano dal Pozzo paper museum. And following his death, it passed through his family until it was sold in 1703 to Pope Clement XI, and then in 1714 to the powerful and wealthy Albani family. The Albani were already in possession of a significant art collection, to which they allowed 18th century scholars access for their personal study. Indeed, during his grand tour in 1755 to 58, Robert Adam had visited the Albani collection, and he actually opened negotiations for the purchase of the Dal Pozzo collection on behalf of King George III. This being concluded by his brother James Adam during his own grand tour in 1762. On the 10th of July 1762, James wrote to Robert confirming the purchase not only on behalf of the king, but also of a selection of items for the brothers' personal use, later purchased by Soane at the 1818 Adam sale. Bit cheeky, really. Robert and James skimmed off the cream of the crop for their own collection and gave everything else to George III. So the items that they acquired from the Albani were 3 volumes of drawings by Giovanni Battista Montano, the fabulous Codex Conaire, an image from which you can see here, containing drawings by Bernardo della Volpaia, and which had been studied by Michelangelo when he was training himself to become an architect. There's a volume of drawings by Alberti, the so-called Vasari album, containing drawings by Tiepolo Torri and Orazio Porta. And at the same time in 1818, Stone had also purchased loose drawings by Jean-Baptiste Larmand, Charles-Louis Closeau, Laurent Pechot, Giovanni Battista Piranesi, Robert and James Adam themselves, William Sandby, William Kent, as well as an important volume of drawings by Carlo Fontana, all of which had been in the Adam Brothers collection. Robert and James's sisters died in 1796 and 1820, and finally their brother William died in 1822, leaving their niece, their carer, Susanna Clarke, to inherit the one surviving treasure that had remained in the family's possession, Robert and James Adams' own architectural office drawings collection. These drawings were of a consistently high quality, as the Adam office, unlike Soane, employed only professional draftsmen, and they never took on students. The sculptor John Flaxman had advised the Adam family that the Adam family that the office drawings collection was worth 500 guineas, an awful lot of money. And William had tried to capitalize on that. He'd made repeated efforts to sell the drawings in the 1820s, even editing the collection into typologically arranged folios in the hope of making them more saleable. However, with the Adam style out of fashion and the drawings not yet old enough to attract any antiquarian interest, they remained unsold and they were inherited by Susanna. She first offered them to the British Museum, who declined. Bit of an error there. And then she took them with her to Edinburgh, where she went to live with her bachelor brother, who was a very successful judge, a chap called Lord Eldin. Further attempts were made to sell the Adam drawings at the sale of Eldin's possessions in 1833, but to no avail. And finally, later in 1833, Susanna approached Sir John Soane, who had just applied for his private Act of Parliament, under which he left his museum to the British nation. After much indecision, Soane purchased the entire surviving Adam office drawings collection, comprising 54 large volumes, for the bargain basement price of £200. These were returned to London cheaply as deck cargo on the Soho steamer, which runs from Edinburgh down to London, down the east coast of Britain, in July 1833. A further 3 volumes of Adam drawings in the same collection are composed of the loose sheets purchased at the Christie's sale in 1818 and a handful purchased at the Nash sale in 1835, totaling 57 volumes containing 9,000 drawings. That's over 80% of the surviving Adam drawings in the entire world. It's just extraordinary. The final phase of Soane's drawings collecting took place following his decision to leave the Soane Museum to the nation in 1833. From that time onwards, Soane had far fewer outstanding architectural responsibilities. He resigned from the Bank of England, for example, he retired essentially, and instead he focused on increasing the range and volume of his drawings collection. With the assistance of the antiquarian John Britton, Soane negotiated purchases from a variety of sources. Moreover, with the Soane Museum's growing reputation as a national institution, many people made Soane a gift of drawings or wrote to him to offer drawings for sale. These included C.H. Tatham, who sent drawings by Sir Christopher Wren and Nicholas Hawksmoor for Greenwich Royal Hospital in 1833, receiving £10 in return. The last major drawings collection at the Soane Museum arrived on the 18th of November 1836, just a few weeks before Soane died on the 20th of January 1837. Soane's accounts show that he paid the generous sum of £500 for the drawings collection of his late friend and former master, George Dance the Younger. This comprised 1,300 drawings from Dance's own office, just shy of 300 prints, and 6 volumes of drawings in other hands, including numerous drawings by George Dance the Elder. On the 31st of March 1836, George Dance the Younger's son and heir, Lieutenant Colonel Sir Charles Webb Dance, had written to Soane in order to offer him the collection. And I'll just read you part of that letter because it's rather charming. I have examined all my dear father's drawings, which are very voluminous and in high preservation. The architectural library is also a very excellent one. Were I not very much reduced in my finances, I would have felt inclined to follow your noble example by presenting this very valuable collection to be deposited in your National Gallery. But having 4 sons to educate, and besides bring up 3 daughters, I should be neither doing my duty to myself or to them if I were to part with this, my dear father's collection, without a very handsome consideration. Clearly, Soane felt some obligation of generosity to the son of his old friend. Happily, the Dance collection was housed within a fine piece of furniture containing 5 drawers, designed by Dance himself, and known to Soane as the Shrine, which tells you something about how Soane felt about Dance. It's rather nice. At the time of Soane's death, this shrine, this cabinet, was located in the library dining room of the museum, but it was moved a few times over the years, and since 1970, it has been in the north drawing room, as you can see in this photograph. It's placed in the centre of the room. It's a very large piece of furniture, and it's a forcible and welcome reminder to all of the museum's visitors of the importance that Soane placed on his collection of drawings. So I have had the extraordinary privilege of working with and among Sir John Soane's fabulous collection of drawings every day for the last 12 years. But I do lament the fact that we can't share them as much as some other media of art. And of course, artworks on paper are very fragile and have to be protected, particularly from light. And this means that they are generally kept safely stored away in drawers and volumes. And of course, we have everything beautifully professionally photographed, and that's thanks to very generous funding from the Leon Levy Foundation. And all of those images can be found online if you're interested. They're attached to our ever-growing scholarly online catalogues. And now there's also my book, of course, which I hope you'll buy, published by Batsford, which details around 80 of the key items in the drawings collection. But there's really nothing like seeing drawings at first hand. The exhibition, Hidden Masterpieces, as heartbreaking as it was to try to whittle down a small enough number of items to fit in our gallery, not even 0.1% of the collection is included in the show, it has absolutely delighted me, as it's a genuinely an unusual, unique opportunity for some of the choicest highlights of the drawings collection to be shown all together, without the constraints of a theme or a specific exhibition narrative. It's merely my own pick and mix selection of some of the best bits of the collection. So I hope you will allow us, I hope you will sort of forgive me if you don't like my selection. It's a rather strangely personal thing to have my taste so forcibly on display, but I hope that the selection allows everyone to see the way that drawings, particularly architectural drawings, of course function as practical documents. They're records of our shared history, but they're also very often exquisite works of art in themselves. And they can really very often rival their so-called fine art cousins. So I hope you have a chance to visit the show, and I hope you'll love the drawings as much as I do. I'm now a bit hoarse, so I'll stop there. Thank you very much indeed.
Fran, thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. And
I'm trying to stop sharing my screen. There we are.
Oh, there we go. Lovely. Thank you. And we've got a question from Phoebe Simmons, who would like to know, as the drawing collection is so vast, how on earth did you decide which particular works to take out of the archive and put on display? And perhaps you could just talk through your process really of making those selections.
Yeah,
and what really informed you. I mean, you've suggested that a lot was down to your personal taste, but I'm sure there was more to it than that.
Of course. I mean, it was really tricky. I was helped out by the fact that I had to select 80 highlights for the book to start with. And that was a process which I was helped with by some of my colleagues, some of my very knowledgeable curatorial colleagues at Soane Museum. and the publication team at Batsford, because of course everybody has their opinion. I had sort of produced a list of about 200 that I thought were all fabulous, and then that group kind of said what they thought. So it came down to the taste of a small committee, essentially. And then because the show came out of the book and we wanted them to be closely aligned, I then selected the content of the exhibition from what had been included in the book. And as strange as it might sound, producing an exhibition is a rather cutthroat process, because of course you have all these things you want to show, but with works on paper particularly, you sometimes have to kind of swallow the pill and realize that a lot of things aren't appropriate for exhibition. Things might not be in good enough condition. They might be too big, they might be too small, they might have been exhibited recently and need to be on a rest period, they might be in a volume that can't be opened for a long period of time, that sort of thing. So a lot of practicalities came to play. So of the 80, I'd say maybe 3/4 of them would have been suitable for exhibition. So I had 60 to choose from. I think there are 23 or 24 items in the show. So yeah, it came down to personal taste, basically.
And I'm sure the size, as you mentioned, had a lot to do with it, because the exhibition spaces are reasonably small, aren't they?
Yeah.
So there are considerations along those lines too.
Yeah, so the Telegraph described the show as bijou, and I don't know if that's a compliment or not.
Well, I think it's perhaps a slightly backhanded compliment. It's a, bijou, it's a lovely jewel, but, we could have obviously had a much larger exhibition.
Sure, not from the neighbouring building and we'd be fine.
Well, quite. Can you tell us about, anything surprising in the collection? Did anything, there are 30,000 drawings there. Is there, and you've touched upon, there's a medieval manuscript in there, and also in the exhibition, and will be the subject of a future online lecture. There's there are some Indian miniatures, aren't there? Is there anything else that is sort of, slightly outside what you would expect?
Sure. I mean, there's quite a large variety. I'd say about 5% of the collection is non-architectural. I am one of, I'd say, less than half a dozen people in the world who's laid eyes on every single item in the drawings collection. So I'm familiar with all of it. But there are some of those things are unexpected. So you've mentioned the Indian and Persian miniatures. We have 10 medieval illuminated manuscripts. I chose my favorite one. And we have all sorts of strange things. So there's a lovely book which has plates showing different breeds of cattle, for example. We have some beautiful drawings which are designs of silk to be sold at Spitalfields. There's all manner of weird and wonderful things, but if you're interested, do have a look online. As I say, it's mostly architectural, not that that's a bad thing, some gorgeous stuff. There is quite a variety.
And following on slightly from that question, we have one from Phoebe Simmons, who says, as some of these drawings present narratives from across the world, do you think this could engage with wider audiences and give us a deeper understanding about architectural practices in different countries?
To an extent, yes. We have, of course, in recent years, all of us, the academic community, have all been focusing on a wider remit of subject matters of that sort. Challenging histories, a large umbrella term. And because the collection is so varied and deals with subject matters from across the world, that certainly is a potential. I think that the vast majority of architects that are represented in the collection are European, though of course we have drawings that show subject matters from almost every continent in the world, not South America and not Antarctica, otherwise yes. So unfortunately we don't have representation of Asian or African or American architects per se. We do have representation of architects from across Europe. We have an architect working in Russia, all sorts of interesting things. So yes, I think that's certainly a possibility. The research opportunities are endless. So please do come and do some research and write a book and we can read all about it.
I have another question here from Mary Yakub, who wants to know, were doodles or rough sketches ever kept or collected? And can you say more about when architecture drawings were appreciated as artworks in their own right?
Sure. So I think architectural drawings have been appreciated as artworks really since the early 17th century. They were being purchased by prospective clients as individual works of art from that time onwards. Of course, that was to inform prospective construction projects, but the drawings themselves were sold as individual items with an individual price tag, unlike how architects work today. And quite often they would be framed or kept or very carefully put away as other works of art or collected works would have been. So I think they've definitely fallen within that remit for a very long time. I think in the 20th century, they slightly stopped being viewed in that way, because I think, not to disparage my more recent lovely architects, I think that 20th century architectural drawings tend to be a little bit more perfunctory in nature, aesthetically speaking, than their earlier counterparts. So we've sort of fallen out of the habit, particularly with digital architectural drawings, we've fallen out of the habit of thinking of them as artworks, but certainly our early modern forebears would have done so. And I've forgotten the second half of the question. Preliminary sketches, yes. So the named architect, excuse me, in an office would nearly always be the one producing the doodles, the scrappy sketches that would be the starting point of any architectural composition. And they would be drawn on anything whenever inspiration struck. The Adam office is particularly fun for that. You have Robert Adam particularly doodling on the backs of pages, the back of playing cards, even whenever inspiration struck. And these are really scrappy doodles. Yes, they're very definitely kept. And then, as I said in the lecture, they're then translated by the draftsman into these more worked up, scaled, lavish drawings that we're familiar with.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Fran. I'm aware of the time, so I think we should wrap up. But let me just let you know about some forthcoming online events and in-person events, indeed, that complement the exhibition. On the 26th of April, Dr. Ursula Weeks is giving an online lecture about Soane's Indian album, as we mentioned, a hidden treasure of the late Mughal era. So that details are all on our website. And we've also got a couple of remaining slots on a practical bookbinding workshop that's taking place at the museum on Saturday, the 21st of May. Participants will be sewing a book using the historic Coptic binding. And as part of that day, there will be a visit to the archives hosted by Fran, where she'll be showing the group some historic bindings in the collection. And for those of you interested in learning more about Soane's Royal Academy drawings, examples of which we saw earlier, Fran's going to be giving a free online lecture on the 14th of April at 6:30. And this is part of the BBC's Art That Made Us Festival. And a week later, on the 20th of April, if you happen to be in London, Fran's going to be hosting 2 in-person sessions in the archive to show a selection of these magnificent drawings. Spaces are very limited. There are a few left still, but do have a look at the website and snap up those places if you're going to be in London. So yes, the full details are on the website, and you can book for all of our talks through the website. So it just remains to me to thank you all very much for joining us this evening, and to extend everyone's thanks to Fran. We have a raised hand. Let me just check. To thank Fran for such a wonderful talk. And if anyone does want to ask a final question or make a comment, then please do so now. Otherwise, I think that's us. Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.